Fairly. Officer Reed let out a bitter laugh at Nathan's request, treating it like a joke. Let me tell you something, Mr. Civil Rights. Life isn't fair, especially for people who think they're better than the rest of us. His words cut through the air, casting a shadow of injustice over the bustling street with towering skyscrapers looming in the background. But hidden in the glitzy heart of this city were dark corners, places where fairness was scarce, where power didn't always mean protection. Under Reed's scrutinizing gaze and with tension crackling in the air, what will Nathan do next to stand up for himself and for justice? Why is he being treated this way? And who is Nathan, really? Join us as we follow his journey to uncover the truth and seek justice in today's story. But before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story about the journey for justice and righteousness warms your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for more powerful stories. In the heart of a bustling city, where the early morning sun cast its first rays over tall buildings and crowded streets, Nathan Carter, a black man in his late 30s, walked with a quiet confidence that both blended with and set him apart from the morning rush. Dressed in a tailored gray suit, Nathan's polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he moved steadily through the streams of people around him. His eyes held a calm focus as he adjusted the cuffs of his white shirt, radiating an unspoken self-assurance that drew occasional glances. Nathan had just finished his regular breakfast at a corner cafe, where the staff knew him by name and greeted him with familiarity. He ordered scrambled eggs, turkey sausage, and fresh fruit, the same meal he'd enjoyed since he moved to the city over a decade ago. Outside, as he made his way toward his car, a sleek silver sedan parked near a row of coffee shops, Nathan pulled out his phone to check a message from his sister reminding him about their upcoming family dinner. Smiling, he typed a quick reply, reassuring her he hadn't forgotten. As Nathan slipped his phone back into his pocket and reached for his car keys, he noticed two police officers walking towards him with a noticeable intensity in their expressions. Their focus was unwavering, their eyes narrowing as they approached, and even before they reached him, Nathan felt a slight knot of tension form in his stomach. He knew the drill all too well, the early lessons from his father ringing in his ears, lessons that had become second nature by now. Stay calm, show respect, and avoid any reason for escalation. The first officer, a stout man with a closely shaven head and a stern demeanor, addressed him with an abrupt, "Excuse me, sir." His tone was sharp, almost abrasive, as he looked Nathan over. The name on his badge read Reed. The second officer, a lanky figure named Cummings, stood just a step behind, his hand casually resting on his utility belt, close to his holster. Nathan felt the tension radiating off them, sensed it in the way their eyes seemed to appraise every inch of him. "Yes, officer?" Nathan replied, his voice measured and steady. He kept his posture relaxed, his hands visible, a gesture of transparency and calm that had become instinctual over the years. "Can we see some ID?" Reed demanded, barely a trace of politeness in his tone. There was no greeting, no explanation, just an order. Nathan held the officer's gaze for a brief moment, considering his response. He hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't even interacted with anyone except the cafe staff, yet he knew how quickly situations like these could escalate. His father's words replayed in his mind, cautioning him. "May I ask why?" Nathan responded, his voice calm but firm. He made sure to keep eye contact, balancing respect with a quiet assertion of his rights. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Just show us your ID, sir. It's a simple request." His voice had an edge, and there was a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if he were issuing a challenge. Nathan kept his composure, nodding slightly as he reached slowly into his jacket pocket to retrieve his wallet. "All right," he said, pulling out his ID and offering it to the officer. "I'd still like to understand why I'm being stopped, though." Reed took the ID, glancing down at it, while Cummings shifted his stance, positioning himself closer, as though preparing for a confrontation. Nathan's instincts went on high alert, but he maintained his calm. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being scrutinized as though he were some sort of threat. After a long pause, Reed handed the ID back to him, his eyes still cold and probing. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Reed asked, his voice carrying an accusatory tone. Nathan raised an eyebrow, genuinely confused. I live here, he replied evenly. I'm just heading to my car to get to work. Is there a problem, officer? Ignoring the question, Reed continued, Where are you coming from? I had breakfast at the cafe down the block, Nathan answered, his tone measured. He could sense where this line of questioning was heading. It was a familiar routine. A well-dressed black man in an affluent neighborhood must surely be suspicious. It was a reality he'd faced many times before, yet it never became easier to stomach. Reed's lips twisted into a smirk as he eyed Nathan up and down. We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area, he said, his tone dripping with thinly veiled contempt. You match the description of someone we're looking for. A familiar wave of frustration washed over Nathan, but he kept his expression neutral. He knew better than to react. I see, he replied, maintaining his calm. I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. I was about to head to work. What kind of work do you do? Reed interrupted, his voice skeptical. Nathan took a steadying breath before answering. I'm an attorney, he replied, meeting Reed's gaze directly. I actually have a meeting to get to, so if there's nothing else, I'd like to be on my way. The revelation seemed to catch Reed off guard, and the smirk on his face faltered, if only for a second. An attorney, huh? He sounded unconvinced. You sure you're not hiding anything in that fancy car of yours? Nathan could feel the tension mounting, like a thick fog settling around them. He knew the risks, knew how a single wrong word could turn this encounter dangerously hostile. There's nothing illegal in my car, officer, he replied firmly. You're welcome to check, but I'd prefer if we didn't waste any more of your time or mine. Reed's eyes hardened. You don't get to decide how we do our job, Mr. Attorney. Step away from the car. Nathan hesitated, his father's voice echoing in his mind, urging him to stay calm, to keep things from escalating. But he knew compliance wouldn't guarantee his safety, either. Still, he raised his hands slightly to show he posed no threat and took a step back from the car. Without warning, Reed lunged forward, grabbing Nathan's arm and twisting it behind his back. The sudden move sent a sharp jolt of pain up Nathan's shoulder, and before he could process what was happening, Cummings joined in, forcing him down onto the pavement. Hey, what are you doing? Nathan protested, his voice strained with the discomfort, though he struggled to keep calm. He knew he wasn't resisting, but their treatment suggested otherwise. You're under arrest for resisting arrest, Reed declared coldly as he tightened the cuffs around Nathan's wrists. Stunned, Nathan could hardly believe what he was hearing. Resisting arrest? He'd done everything they asked, complied with every instruction, but it didn't matter. Their minds had been made up long before he spoke. The commotion quickly drew attention from the people around. An elderly woman peered from her balcony, horrified, while a young couple on the sidewalk began recording the scene, their faces etched with disbelief. This is wrong, someone shouted from the crowd, but Reed and Cummings ignored the bystanders, their expressions unreadable as they led Nathan to the squad car. As they shoved him into the back seat, Nathan managed to look out the window, catching sight of the growing crowd, their faces a mixture of anger and concern. Taking a deep breath, he gathered his strength, and with a steady voice called out, "This isn't over." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air as the car pulled away, leaving the crowd in stunned silence. Inside the vehicle, Nathan's mind raced, but one thought dominated. He would find justice, and this injustice would not go unanswered. Inside the cramped back seat of the police car, Nathan Carter sat in silence, his wrists still smarting from the tight cuffs. The officer's eyes occasionally flickered to the rearview mirror, their expressions a blend of irritation and satisfaction. Nathan took a slow breath, forcing himself to calm down despite the anger and humiliation churning inside him. His father's voice echoed in his mind, a reminder of the careful balance he needed to maintain. Stay calm, stay composed. Let them lose their temper, not you. As the car sped through the city streets, Nathan sensed that the officers were eager to draw out this encounter, even though they'd already made up their minds. He kept his gaze steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But his silence seemed to irritate Officer Reed. who soon turned to face him, an expression of thinly veiled disdain on his face. "So, Mr. Big Shot Attorney," Reed sneered, the title dripping with sarcasm. "What were you really doing in this part of town, huh? Doesn't exactly seem like the place for someone like you." Nathan met Reed's gaze evenly, refusing to be baited by his tone. "I was having breakfast, officer. That's all," he replied simply. "I visit that cafe often. The staff know me there." Reed rolled his eyes, chuckling dryly. "Right. Breakfast. Tell me, what kind of lawyer wastes his time having breakfast in a place like that? Seems a little too convenient." Nathan knew what Reed was insinuating. It was clear that Reed couldn't fathom the idea of a black man with Nathan's composure and confidence simply living his life in that part of the city. "It's convenient because it's close to my office," Nathan replied, his voice level, though he felt the first tinges of anger creeping in. He reminded himself again of his father's advice: maintain control, don't let them dictate the direction of the interaction. But Reed wasn't about to let it go. "So, what exactly do you do, Nathan? Do you represent people who, need to bend the law a little to get by?" His words were soaked in innuendo, his smirk a constant reminder of the power he wielded. Nathan clenched his jaw briefly, but then relaxed, refusing to let the frustration show. "I practice civil rights law," he replied, keeping his tone as even as possible. "I work on behalf of people who don't have the resources to defend themselves. It's honest work, officer." Reed raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Civil rights, huh? So, I bet you're one of those guys who think the police are the bad guys, here to expose corruption, ruin careers, and make trouble for decent officers, right?" The weight of Reed's accusation was heavy in the air, filling the cramped space of the car with tension. Nathan could feel his patience thinning, the urge to respond with all the frustration he felt growing. But he caught himself, forcing calmness to prevail. "No, officer. I'm here to help protect the rights of people who might otherwise be overlooked or marginalized. My job isn't about causing trouble. It's about upholding justice." For a moment, Reed seemed thrown off by Nathan's calm demeanor, as though he'd expected an outburst. Cummings, who had been silently observing from the front seat, suddenly spoke up, his voice filled with a subtle threat. "You seem pretty confident for someone in your position, Nathan. Doesn't seem like the smartest move." Nathan took a deep breath, steadying himself before responding. "I have nothing to hide. I complied with your instructions and answered your questions. I'm simply asking for the same respect." Reed's smirk faded slightly, replaced with a look of thinly veiled irritation. "Respect? You're asking for respect?" he scoffed, exchanging a glance with Cummings. "You want respect, you earn it. And right now, you're looking like just another guy who thinks he's above the rules because he's got a fancy title." Nathan tightened his grip on his own calm, feeling the frustration brewing under his skin. He could feel his heartbeat in his temples, but he kept his expression neutral. He knew that one wrong word could escalate this situation further, so he chose his words carefully. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm simply asking to be treated fairly." Reed let out a bitter laugh, as though Nathan's request was some kind of joke. "Fairly?" he repeated mockingly. "Let me tell you something, Mr. Civil Rights. Life isn't fair, especially for people who think they're better than the rest of us." Nathan remained silent, letting Reed's words hang in the air. He felt a familiar sense of resignation, the same feeling he'd had countless times before in situations just like this. It didn't matter what he said. These officers had already judged him, labeled him, and nothing he could say would change their minds. His silence seemed to agitate them even more, though, as if they were waiting for him to slip up, to give them a reason to take things further. In a final attempt to maintain some semblance of control, Nathan spoke slowly and carefully. "Officers, I'm simply trying to get to my job. If there's nothing further, I'd like to go about my day." Cummings turned to look at him with a raised brow, the challenge clear in his gaze. "We'll decide when we're done here. Until then, you'll do as you're told." Nathan clenched his jaw again, fighting the urge to respond. He knew this was a game of patience now, a test of endurance. They were waiting for him to crack, to show frustration or anger so they could justify any further mistreatment. But he wouldn't give them that. He refused to let them strip him of his dignity. The car came to a stop at a red light, and Nathan could see people passing by on the street, completely unaware of the tense encounter unfolding inside the vehicle. For a brief moment, he locked eyes with a woman walking her dog. She glanced at him with a mix of curiosity and sympathy, but she quickly looked away, leaving Nathan feeling even more isolated in his current predicament. Reed let out a small chuckle, breaking the silence. You know, Nathan, guys like you, with your fancy suits and your law degrees, think you're better than the rest of us. But out here, you're just another suspect, no different from anyone else. Nathan took another deep breath, focusing on the words of his father, who had been his guide through countless moments of prejudice and bias. Remember, son, your strength is in your self-control. Don't let them see you rattle. And so he kept his composure, even as the officers continued to probe him with loaded questions and insinuations. He'd faced worse before, and he knew he'd make it through this too. Finally, Reed turned to him one last time before the car pulled into the precinct parking lot. You want justice, Mr. Carter? We'll show you just how we handle justice here. As they stepped out of the vehicle, Nathan felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that whatever came next wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to remain calm, to hold on to the strength and resolve that had brought him this far. As Nathan stepped out of the police car, he straightened himself, trying to shake off the stiffness from the tight handcuffs. The air felt thick with tension as officers Reed and Cummings closed in on him, their expressions hard and unyielding. Nathan's mind raced, each heartbeat a reminder to remain calm. He had done nothing wrong, and yet, here he was, facing a storm that he could sense was about to erupt. Turn around, Reed commanded, his voice sharp. Nathan obliged, keeping his gaze steady, refusing to show the frustration and anger building inside. Just as he turned, he felt Reed's grip tighten around his arm, harsh and unyielding. Careful, officer. I'm not resisting, Nathan said, his voice calm but strained. Reed didn't respond. Instead, his grip intensified, as though daring Nathan to react. Then, without warning, Reed shoved him forcefully against the hood of the police car, his cheek pressing against the cold metal. The impact sent a sharp jolt of pain through Nathan's shoulder, but he gritted his teeth, determined not to give them the reaction they seemed to be waiting for. Stay still, Reed barked, pushing him down with his full weight. Nathan could feel the burn of humiliation creeping up his spine, but he reminded himself of his father's words, echoing like a calming mantra in his mind. This wasn't the time to push back. Not yet. Around them, a small crowd had started to gather, drawn by the commotion. People paused, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock as they took in the sight of Nathan, a well-dressed, composed black man, being manhandled by two officers with clear hostility. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd, their voices tinged with confusion and outrage. Hey, what's going on? A young woman called out, her phone already raised, capturing every moment of the encounter. The murmurs grew louder as others pulled out their phones, recording and whispering to each other. Nathan caught a glimpse of the woman recording, her face etched with concern. The sight of her gave him a momentary sense of relief. If nothing else, there would be a record of what was happening here. A small glimmer of hope amid the anger and fear brewing inside him. Reed seemed to notice the crowd as well, but instead of being deterred, he seemed emboldened, his actions growing harsher. Let's make this clear, Nathan, he hissed, his voice low enough for only Nathan to hear. People like you think you can get away with anything, but not today. Nathan took a deep, calming breath. He was painfully aware of the eyes on him, of the phones capturing every painful twist of his arm, every degrading shove. He wanted to protest, to defend his dignity, but he knew that any sign of resistance would only give them more fuel. Look at this, a man in the crowd shouted, his voice carrying over the growing murmurs. This man hasn't done anything wrong. Why are you treating him like this? Reed's expression tightened, a flicker of annoyance passing over his face. Step back, folks, he ordered, raising his voice to address the crowd. This is a police matter. Nothing to see here. But the crowd was no longer just watching. They were reacting, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, her hand on her heart, eyes wide with anger. "I've seen this man here every morning," she shouted. "He's done nothing wrong. Let him go." The commotion seemed to rattle Cummings, who glanced uneasily at Reed. "Maybe we should take this inside, get him booked quietly," he muttered under his breath. But Reed shook his head, his grip on Nathan unyielding. "Not a chance," Reed replied, his voice laced with defiance. "This one's going to learn his lesson today." Nathan felt a surge of anger but swallowed it, his jaw clenched tight. The crowd's support was a comfort, but he knew it could only do so much. Still, he appreciated their voices, their willingness to stand up for him even as he felt helpless. Suddenly, Reed yanked Nathan upright, the cuffs digging into his wrists as he was forced to his feet. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest," Reed declared loudly, as if putting on a show for the crowd. "Resisting arrest?" a young man in the crowd repeated incredulously. "He hasn't done anything. We've all been watching." Another voice chimed in, this time from an elderly man who had been watching from a nearby bench. "This isn't justice," he called out, his voice shaking with anger. "This is harassment." As Reed and Cummings started leading Nathan toward the station, the crowd's voices grew louder, a collective roar of disapproval that seemed to echo down the street. People followed, their phones recording, their voices demanding answers. It was as if a silent pact had been made. These strangers, once merely bystanders, were now advocates, demanding justice for a man they barely knew. One by one, the voices began to merge, their anger and disbelief creating a powerful, unified force. "Justice for Nathan," someone shouted, and soon, others took up the chant, their words reverberating through the air like a call to action. "Justice for Nathan! Justice for Nathan!" Reed's face flushed with irritation, but he held his ground, his jaw set as he continued dragging Nathan forward. Despite the pain, despite the humiliation, Nathan held his head high, drawing strength from the crowd's unwavering support. In the midst of the chaos, Nathan locked eyes with a young boy who was watching from the edge of the crowd, his face a mixture of fear and confusion. Nathan offered him a small, reassuring nod, a silent promise that he would get through this, that he would endure. He had to, for himself, for his community, and for everyone who had ever faced the same injustice. As they approached the entrance of the precinct, the crowd showed no signs of dispersing. If anything, they grew louder, their chants filling the air, their presence a testament to the resilience and unity that had emerged from one man's wrongful arrest. "This isn't over," a woman yelled, her voice ringing out over the chanting. "We're not going anywhere until we see justice served." The scene was electric, a powerful display of solidarity that sent a chill down Nathan's spine. He knew that this moment, this public outcry, was more than just support. It was a refusal to let the injustice go unchallenged. Reed and Cummings exchanged a quick glance, their frustration palpable as they pushed Nathan through the precinct doors. But the chanting continued outside, the voices of the crowd seeping into the building, a persistent reminder that the community would not be silenced. Inside, as Nathan was led down a narrow corridor, he could still hear the distant echo of the crowd's chant, their voices a lifeline that kept his resolve steady. He knew the road ahead would be tough, that the fight for justice was far from over. But with the strength of the community behind him, he was ready to face whatever came next. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a larger fight, a fight for dignity, equality, and the right to exist without fear. And as long as those voices were calling his name, he knew he wouldn't be facing it alone. Inside the dimly lit police station, Nathan was led through a series of gray corridors, his footsteps echoing against the cold tile floor. His wrists were still bound tightly by the cuffs, and his shoulders ached from the rough handling. He felt a surge of frustration mixed with humiliation as Reed and Cummings pushed him forward. He'd been in police stations countless times before, but always as an advocate, never as a detainee. The officers finally brought him to the booking area, where they unceremoniously deposited him on a bench. Several other officers glanced up briefly, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and indifference, as if Nathan were just another face in the crowd. But one officer's eyes lingered a little longer, a young man named Officer Eric Stevens. Fresh out of the academy, Stevens had a sharp, observant gaze and a sense of duty that still held idealism. As Nathan sat on the bench, he noticed Stevens looking at him with a puzzled expression, brow furrowed as though he were trying to place where he'd seen Nathan before. Stevens had heard whispers of the crowd outside, their chants for justice reverberating faintly through the station walls, and now, seeing this man seated quietly in front of him, he felt a growing curiosity. Reed, noticing Stevens' gaze, gave him a dismissive nod. "Just another troublemaker who thought he could play hero out on the street," he muttered. Stevens frowned slightly, still watching Nathan. There was something about him, an air of confidence and dignity that didn't quite match the usual detainees he'd encountered. Ignoring Reed's remark, Stevens made his way over to the booking computer, intending to process the man's information. He typed in Nathan's name, and within moments, a profile appeared on the screen, complete with a photo and a list of credentials that made Stevens' eyes widen in shock. "Wait a minute," Stevens muttered under his breath, barely containing his surprise. The name Nathan Carter wasn't just a name. It was a reputation, one that had echoed through news articles, legal forums, and civil rights circles. Nathan Carter was a well-known civil rights attorney who had taken on cases that challenged systemic injustices, someone who had the power and influence to make real changes. Stevens' heart pounded as the realization set in. Without waiting, he quickly pulled up a few articles online, skimming through them to confirm what he suspected. Each article detailed Nathan's work, his dedication to defending those without a voice, and his victories in the courtroom against oppressive institutions. Stevens' shock deepened as he began to comprehend the gravity of the situation. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Kate Thompson entered the station, her heels clicking briskly on the floor as she headed towards the booking area. Thompson was known for her sharp mind and no-nonsense approach to leadership. She transferred to this precinct only a few months earlier, but had quickly earned the respect of her peers. News of Nathan's arrest had reached her office, and given the crowd gathering outside, she decided it was time to take charge of the situation. As she approached, Stevens noticed her and quickly gestured for her attention. "Lieutenant Thompson, I think there's something you need to see," he said, his tone urgent. Thompson looked at him with a hint of impatience. "What is it, Stevens?" Stevens glanced around, making sure no one else was listening, then lowered his voice. "The man they just brought in, Nathan Carter, isn't just anyone. He's a high-profile civil rights attorney." Thompson's eyes narrowed as she processed this information. "Are you sure?" "Yes, ma'am," Stevens replied, pulling up the articles on his screen. "I recognized his name and looked it up. He's been involved in some major cases, challenging police misconduct and winning big. If the public finds out we've arrested him under suspicious circumstances, it could blow up in our faces." Thompson's face remained composed, but a spark of understanding flickered in her eyes. She knew immediately that this was a delicate matter. She had no patience for officers who abused their power, and if the officers involved had mishandled this arrest, the consequences would be severe. "Where are Officers Reed and Cummings?" Thompson asked, her voice low but commanding. "They're finishing up the booking paperwork, ma'am," Stevens replied, glancing over at the two officers, who were oblivious to the growing tension. "Stay here, Stevens," Thompson said, her tone brooking no argument. She made her way toward Reed and Cummings, her posture exuding authority as she approached them. Reed looked up from his paperwork, his casual demeanor faltering slightly under Thompson's stern gaze. "Lieutenant Thompson," he greeted, trying to sound composed, though there was a slight edge of unease in his voice. "Officers, I've heard some things about this arrest that concern me," Thompson said, crossing her arms. "From what I understand, there's quite a crowd gathered outside, protesting how this man, Nathan Carter, was handled. Care to explain what exactly led to his detainment?" Reed exchanged a glance with Cummings, his confidence visibly wavering. "Lieutenant, we received reports of suspicious activity in the area. When we questioned him, he became uncooperative, and we had reason to believe he was, well, potentially hiding something." "Potentially?" Thompson repeated, her tone sharp. Did he resist? Did he give you any actual cause for suspicion, or was it just a gut feeling? Her words dripped with disdain, challenging the officers to defend their actions. Reed hesitated, his bravado faltering. Well, he questioned why we were stopping him, and things got tense. So, he questioned you, Thompson cut in, her voice icy. And that was grounds for you to arrest him? Reed opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Thompson's steely gaze bore into him, and she could see the discomfort in his expression. Lieutenant, we thought we were handling it by the book, Cummings interjected, his voice a bit shaky. But things escalated quickly. Thompson turned to Cummings, her eyes narrowing. It's your job to de-escalate, not escalate. I expect better judgment from my officers, especially when handling civilians who are well within their rights to ask questions. Stevens, still standing nearby, cleared his throat, drawing Thompson's attention. Lieutenant, if I may add something, I think it's important to recognize just who Nathan Carter is. If word gets out that we arrested him without cause, it could have serious repercussions for the department. Thompson nodded, her jaw set with determination. I'm well aware of that, Stevens. She turned back to Reed and Cummings, her expression resolute. You two are to stay out of this from here on out. I'll handle Mr. Carter personally. Understood? The two officers nodded, looking chastised but relieved to be out of the direct line of fire. Thompson wasted no time. Heading back to where Nathan sat, still handcuffed on the bench. She could feel the eyes of her officers on her, the tension in the room thick as they watched, anticipating her next move. Nathan Carter, she began as she approached him, her tone softer but professional. My name is Lieutenant Kate Thompson. I'm here to ask you a few questions and ensure that you're treated fairly. Nathan met her gaze, his expression guarded but appreciative of her approach. Thank you, Lieutenant, he said, his voice steady. Thompson nodded, glancing at the cuffs on his wrists. First, let's get those off. She motioned to Stevens, who stepped forward to remove the cuffs. As soon as they were released, Nathan rubbed his wrists, a slight sigh of relief escaping him. I apologize for any mistreatment you've endured so far, Thompson said, her tone sincere. I assure you, I intend to get to the bottom of this. We have protocols in place for a reason, and if they've been violated, appropriate actions will be taken. Nathan nodded, feeling a faint glimmer of hope as he looked into Thompson's eyes. There was an integrity there that reassured him, and for the first time since his arrest, he felt as though someone might actually be willing to listen. Thompson took a deep breath, then gestured toward a private room. Let's continue this conversation in a quieter setting. I'd like to understand everything that happened and make sure your rights are fully respected moving forward. With a nod of understanding, Nathan stood, following her toward the room, ready to finally tell his side of the story. After her conversation with Nathan, Lieutenant Kate Thompson returned to her office with a sense of urgency weighing on her. She closed the door behind her, her mind racing as she replayed everything Nathan had shared. The details he'd given her, the questions that had been left unanswered by officers Reed and Cummings, painted a troubling picture. She felt an unsettling suspicion start to grow, one that couldn't be ignored. Determined to get to the truth, Thompson sat down at her computer and began to research Nathan Carter's background in depth. What she found only deepened her concern. News articles, court records, and public statements revealed Nathan as a powerful force in the legal world, a civil rights attorney known for challenging corruption and advocating for marginalized communities. He had taken on some of the biggest cases involving police misconduct, including a few that had garnered national attention. The pattern was undeniable. Nathan Carter didn't just defend people. He held institutions accountable, exposing wrongdoings and demanding justice. Thompson felt a chill as she realized the full scope of what Nathan's presence at the precinct might mean. His influence wasn't limited to the courtroom. It extended into communities, law enforcement, and even politics. If his arrest today had been motivated by something other than a routine stop, then the consequences could be severe. Thompson's instincts told her that this situation had layers far deeper than it appeared, and she knew that whatever she uncovered, transparency would be the only way forward. As she continued her research, A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, looking up to see Officer Reed standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Lieutenant, I thought you might want an update on the situation," Reed began, his tone casual. But Thompson could see the tension in his posture, the way he shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Close the door, officer," Thompson replied, her voice firm. Reed hesitated but did as instructed, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Thompson leaned back in her chair, folding her arms as she looked him over. "I have a few questions for you, Officer Reed, and I'd appreciate complete honesty." Reed stiffened, his face growing defensive. "Of course, ma'am. I'm always honest in my reports." "Good," Thompson replied coolly, "because what I'm hearing from Mr. Carter does not match the report you submitted. According to him, he complied with every instruction you gave. He asked reasonable questions, and instead of an explanation, he was met with hostility. Care to explain?" Reed's jaw tightened, and he looked away briefly before meeting her gaze again. "Lieutenant, I was simply doing my job. We had reports of suspicious activity, and Mr. Carter fit the description." "Did he?" Thompson challenged, her eyes narrowing. "Or did he simply happen to be a well-dressed black man in a part of town you didn't expect him to be in?" Reed's face reddened, but he quickly masked his irritation. "I don't appreciate the implication, Lieutenant. I don't make decisions based on race." Thompson raised an eyebrow, unrelenting. "Then explain why you felt the need to arrest him when he posed no threat and followed every directive you gave. You know as well as I do that there's a protocol for handling these situations, and from what I've gathered, you disregarded it." Reed's defensiveness turned into anger. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, you weren't there. You don't know how these situations can escalate." "Escalate?" Thompson's voice was sharp now. "The only escalation I'm seeing is the one you caused by treating a law-abiding man as a criminal without cause. Do you realize who you arrested, Officer Reed?" Reed shifted uncomfortably, crossing his arms. "I heard he's some sort of lawyer." "Not just any lawyer," Thompson replied, her tone icy. "Nathan Carter is a prominent civil rights attorney. He's handled cases that have exposed corruption in police departments across the country. His work has led to officers being fired, entire departments being investigated, and policies being reformed. Do you understand the potential consequences of this situation if it gets out?" Reed's expression faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "Lieutenant, I didn't know." "Then perhaps you should have done your due diligence before making that arrest," Thompson replied, her voice low and controlled. "Mr. Carter's arrest has already drawn a crowd outside the station, people demanding justice. And believe me, if they find out who he is, we're looking at a public relations nightmare that could cost this department dearly." For a moment, Reed stood in silence, his posture tense, but his defiance had waned. He seemed to understand, perhaps for the first time, the gravity of his actions. Thompson could see the flicker of realization in his eyes, the weight of the consequences beginning to settle. "This needs to be handled carefully," Thompson continued, her voice softening slightly. "We need transparency, accountability. And most importantly, we need to ensure that nothing like this happens again." Reed swallowed, nodding reluctantly. "So, what do we do?" Thompson leaned forward, her tone unwavering. "First, you and Officer Cummings are to stay out of this. From this point on, I'll be handling Mr. Carter's case personally. Second, you will submit a revised report, one that accurately reflects what happened. I don't want any omissions, and I certainly don't want any distortions. Am I clear?" "Yes, Lieutenant," Reed replied, his tone subdued. "Good," Thompson said, nodding firmly. "You may go." Reed turned and left the office, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Thompson watched him go, a sense of frustration simmering beneath her composed exterior. She knew that accountability would be crucial, not just for Reed and Cummings, but for the entire department. If trust in law enforcement was to be restored, it would start with confronting uncomfortable truths and refusing to sweep problems under the rug. As she sat back in her chair, Thompson allowed herself a brief moment to process everything that had transpired. She knew that taking responsibility wouldn't be easy, that there would be resistance, both from within and outside the department. But she also knew that her role demanded integrity, that she had a duty not only to enforce the law, but to uphold the values behind it. The door opened again, and Stevens entered cautiously, closing the door softly behind him. "Lieutenant," he began, "I just wanted to let you know, the crowd outside has grown. People are calling for answers, for justice." Thompson nodded, her expression resolute. "We'll give them answers, Stevens, but we'll do it the right way. There's too much at stake to allow this situation to spiral out of control." Stevens hesitated, then spoke, his voice laced with concern. "Do you think this could lead to something bigger?" Thompson met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Possibly, but it's up to us to control that narrative. We're responsible for ensuring that justice is served, not just in the courtroom, but here, within our own walls. That starts with transparency and accountability. It starts with us." Stevens nodded, a sense of determination setting in. "What do you need me to do, Lieutenant?" "Keep an eye on things outside. Ensure that there's no escalation," Thompson replied. "I'll be speaking with Mr. Carter again soon. He deserves answers, and we owe him respect." Stevens nodded and left, and Thompson felt a quiet strength settling over her. She knew that the days ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and hard conversations, but she was prepared to face them head-on. For Nathan, for the department, and for every individual who deserved a law enforcement system grounded in justice, not prejudice. She stood, gathering her thoughts and preparing for the next steps. There was a long road ahead, but Thompson was determined to walk it, every step a commitment to justice and transparency that would set a new standard in the precinct. As the day wore on, the crowd outside the police station swelled, voices merging into a unified demand that echoed down the surrounding streets. Signs waved in the air, painted with messages like "Justice for Nathan" and "End Police Bias." The chants grew louder, their fervor cutting through the city's noise, drawing the attention of passers-by, reporters, and even nearby businesses. What had started as a small group of bystanders had transformed into a powerful movement, calling for transparency, accountability, and, most urgently, the immediate release of Nathan Carter. Inside the station, Lieutenant Kate Thompson felt the tension as if it were a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She stood by the window, looking out at the sea of people who had gathered. The protesters' voices were clear, fierce, and unwavering. Their anger, their frustration, and their commitment to justice created an intensity that was hard to ignore. With every chant, Thompson felt her own urgency grow. The situation was on the brink of becoming a full-blown crisis. Thompson turned from the window and walked briskly to her office, where Officer Stevens was waiting. His expression mirrored her own, an uneasy mix of concern and determination. He had been monitoring the situation outside, keeping track of the growing numbers and the escalating calls for action. "Lieutenant," Stevens began, "the crowd is getting larger by the minute. Activists, community leaders, even some members of the press have arrived. They're not going anywhere until they get answers, and Nathan Carter is at the center of it all." Thompson nodded, her gaze hardening as she processed his words. "It was only a matter of time before this became more than just a crowd," she said. "If we keep Nathan here any longer, this could spiral out of control. The public wants justice, and they won't be satisfied with silence or excuses." Stevens shifted, his voice lowering as he spoke. "Do you think releasing him is the right call? I mean, without proper documentation or an official statement." "It's the only call," Thompson replied firmly. "Keeping him here any longer will only add fuel to the fire. We don't have enough grounds to hold him, and from everything I've learned, he's done nothing to justify an arrest in the first place. This was a mistake, a grave one, and the longer we hold him, the greater the risk we face." Stevens nodded, sensing the resolve in Thompson's words. "All right, Lieutenant. I'll prepare the paperwork for his release. But there's still the question of how we handle the crowd." Thompson thought for a moment, her mind racing through potential strategies. She knew that simply releasing Nathan might not be enough. The crowd demanded accountability, an acknowledgement of the wrongs committed, and a promise that this would not happen again. Once we release him, I'll address the crowd myself, she said decisively. They need to know that we're taking this seriously, that we're committed to finding answers and ensuring this doesn't happen again. Silence won't solve this, but transparency might. Stevens hesitated, concern flickering in his eyes. You're sure about this, Lieutenant? That crowd is angry. Facing them, it won't be easy. Thompson nodded, her expression unyielding. I know, but that's what this job requires. Facing the hard truths, even when they're uncomfortable. If we're serious about justice, about rebuilding trust, then we can't hide from this. We have to meet it head-on. With that, Thompson took a deep breath and straightened, feeling the weight of her responsibilities settle over her. She stepped out of her office and made her way toward the holding cell where Nathan was still waiting. As she approached, she could see the tension in his posture, the quiet resilience that had carried him through the ordeal. He looked up as she entered, his eyes reflecting both exhaustion and an unbroken spirit. Nathan, she began, her tone softer, though still resolute. I've decided to release you. This should never have happened, and I'm deeply sorry for the treatment you endured. Nathan studied her, his gaze penetrating as though he were assessing the sincerity in her words. After a brief pause, he nodded, a glimmer of relief breaking through his guarded expression. Thank you, Lieutenant. I appreciate you making the right decision. Thompson gestured for Stevens to unlock the cell, and as the door opened, Nathan stepped out, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had left faint marks. She felt a pang of regret as she looked at those marks, a reminder of the failings within her own department. There's still a large crowd outside, Thompson informed him. They've been calling for justice for your release. I'm planning to speak to them, to address what happened here and take responsibility. I wanted you to know that this isn't just about getting you out of here. We're taking real steps to address what went wrong. Nathan nodded, appreciating her candor. Thank you, Lieutenant. That's all anyone really wants, accountability and change. They walked toward the station's exit, each step feeling like a declaration of purpose, of commitment to a higher standard. Stevens followed closely behind, carrying the final release documents, which Nathan signed with a steady hand. Then, together, they stepped toward the doors, where the sound of chanting grew louder, the words echoing with a force that was impossible to ignore. Thompson took a moment, steadying herself before pushing open the doors and stepping out into the sunlight. The crowd's roar grew as they recognized Nathan, and a wave of relief and triumph rippled through them. Camera flashes lit up the scene, capturing the moment as Nathan walked out, flanked by Thompson and Stevens. The crowd's chanting shifted, some voices calling for answers, others cheering Nathan's release. Thompson raised her hands, signaling for quiet, and gradually, the noise settled into a tense, expectant silence. Thank you for your patience and for your dedication to justice, Thompson began, her voice clear and steady. My name is Lieutenant Kate Thompson, and I'm here to acknowledge the gravity of what has happened here today. She paused, glancing at Nathan, who stood beside her with quiet dignity. Earlier today, Mr. Nathan Carter was arrested without proper grounds. This was a serious mistake, and I take full responsibility for that error. Mr. Carter is a law-abiding citizen, a respected civil rights attorney, and he was wrongfully detained. For that, I apologize, both to him and to all of you. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, but the tension remained. Thompson could see the questions in their eyes, the lingering doubt about what her words would mean in the long term. I want to assure you that we are taking immediate action to investigate what happened, she continued. I understand that words alone won't fix this, but we are committed to change. We will be reviewing our procedures, holding those involved accountable, and working with community leaders to prevent incidents like this from happening in the future. The crowd listened intently, some nodding in agreement, while others remained skeptical. Thompson felt the weight of their scrutiny, but she pressed on, determined to meet their gaze without wavering. Justice isn't just a concept, it's a commitment, one that starts with acknowledging mistakes and taking meaningful action. Today, we're taking that first step, and I promise you, it won't be the last. She turned to Nathan, who met her eyes with a nod of respect. She felt a surge of hope, small, but undeniable. The journey toward accountability and change would be long and difficult, but this moment was a beginning, a chance to rebuild the trust that had been broken. The crowd's tension began to ease, replaced by a cautious optimism. People began to clap, their applause growing until it became a show of support, not only for Nathan, but for the commitment Thompson had made on behalf of the department. As the applause died down, Nathan stepped forward, addressing the crowd himself. "Thank you all for standing by me today," he said, his voice strong and steady. "This fight for justice isn't just mine. It's for every person who has ever been wronged, every voice that's been silenced. Together, we can create a system that serves everyone, not just some. Let's keep pushing forward, holding each other accountable, and ensuring that justice is truly blind." The crowd erupted in applause once more, their voices filled with hope and determination. As Nathan turned back toward the station, Thompson felt a sense of resolve settle over her. The path forward would be challenging, but it was one she was ready to walk, step by step, for a future defined by justice and integrity. With the intense events of the previous days still fresh in everyone's minds, Nathan Carter stood on the steps of the community center, addressing a crowd that had gathered to hear him speak. The media, activists, community leaders, and police officers, all were present, drawn by a shared hope for change. They watched Nathan with anticipation, knowing that this moment wasn't just a speech. It was a pivotal step toward transforming the system that had failed him and countless others. Nathan took a deep breath, allowing himself a moment to absorb the energy of the crowd. He felt the weight of their expectations, but he also felt their support, a sense of unity that made him believe in the possibility of real change. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady and strong. "I stand before you today not just as an individual who experienced injustice, but as a representative of everyone who has ever felt overlooked, mistreated, or powerless in the face of a system that should protect them. This fight is bigger than me. It's about creating a system that truly serves everyone." The crowd nodded, expressions solemn but hopeful. Nathan could see familiar faces, neighbors, community members who had watched him grow up, and it strengthened his resolve. "What happened to me was unjust, but it's not unique," Nathan continued, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "For far too long, too many people in our communities have faced similar experiences, and we've reached a breaking point. It's time for action, for genuine, lasting change." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "This isn't about anger or revenge. It's about building a foundation of trust, mutual respect, and accountability. We need a police force that not only protects us but also understands us, that sees us as allies rather than adversaries." A round of applause broke out, and Nathan felt a surge of optimism. "But this isn't something I can achieve alone," he said, his tone earnest. "Change will only come if we work together. Our community, our leaders, and our police. I'm committed to doing everything in my power to make sure that this isn't just another speech, another promise that fades with time. We're starting something real today, something that will grow and strengthen our city." Standing beside Nathan was Lieutenant Kate Thompson, who nodded in agreement as he spoke. Their alliance was an unlikely one, but Thompson had proven her commitment to justice, and they had come together with a shared goal: to initiate a program that would bridge the gap between the police and the community, fostering trust and transparency. Nathan turned to her, offering her the floor. She stepped forward, her presence calm yet powerful, and addressed the crowd. "As a member of law enforcement, I know the pain that our community has endured," Thompson began, her tone resolute. "I've seen firsthand the impact that mistrust and injustice can have on people's lives. I'm here to acknowledge that we, as an institution, have a responsibility to do better, to be better. And I am committed to working alongside Nathan and all of you to create that change." The crowd listened attentively, their skepticism beginning to soften as Thompson's sincerity shone through. "Today, I'm announcing the launch of the Community Justice Initiative, a program dedicated to fostering transparency, accountability, and respect between law enforcement and the communities we serve. This initiative will focus on 3 key areas: training, community oversight, and open dialogue." Nathan stepped forward again, picking up where she left off. "Through the Community Justice Initiative, we'll be establishing workshops and training programs for officers focused on de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and community engagement. This is about more than just policy. It's about transforming mindsets and rebuilding relationships. The crowd murmured in approval, nodding at the practicality of the approach. The vision felt real, tangible, something they could all be a part of. Thompson continued, "We'll also be forming a community oversight board, made up of residents, local leaders, and experts, who will work directly with the police department to review cases, handle complaints, and ensure that every interaction is handled with integrity. We're giving our community a voice within the department, one that won't be ignored." Nathan could see the spark of hope in the crowd's eyes, a spark that had been absent for too long. The oversight board was a critical component of the initiative, providing transparency and accountability that would allow residents to feel truly represented. "But this isn't just about overseeing and critiquing," Nathan added, his tone compassionate. "It's about creating partnerships. We'll be hosting regular community forums where residents and officers can sit together, talk openly, and understand each other's experiences and perspectives. The goal is to foster a relationship based on empathy and respect." As he spoke, a young woman in the crowd raised her hand, her voice clear and assertive. "How do we know this won't just end up as another promise? How can we be sure these programs will actually make a difference?" Nathan nodded, appreciating the question. "I understand your doubts. Real change requires commitment from all sides. That's why this initiative is built on measurable outcomes. We'll be tracking progress, publishing reports, and making data accessible to the public. You'll see the difference in real time, and we'll hold ourselves accountable every step of the way." Thompson stepped up beside him, her expression firm. "We're also inviting community members to be a part of this process. We want your feedback, your ideas, and your participation. This isn't just a department-led effort, it's a community effort." The woman nodded, her skepticism giving way to a tentative belief. Other voices in the crowd echoed similar sentiments, expressing cautious optimism and a willingness to engage. Nathan looked out at the crowd, his heart swelling with pride. They had come so far, from frustration and anger to unity and hope. He knew this was only the beginning, but it was a promising start, a foundation on which they could build a more just, inclusive community. "Let's remember that change is a journey," Nathan said, his voice strong but gentle. "It won't happen overnight, and there will be challenges along the way. But together, we can make sure that future generations don't have to face the same struggles we did. We're building something new, something better, and it starts with us." As the crowd applauded, he felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. This was what he had been fighting for all his life. A community that stood together, a justice system that served everyone equally, and a future defined by dignity and respect. Thompson extended her hand to Nathan, sealing their commitment with a handshake. The gesture held more than just formality. It was a promise, a shared vision of what they hoped to achieve together. With the applause still echoing, Nathan and Thompson left the stage, knowing that this was only the beginning. The Community Justice Initiative was more than a program. It was a movement, a testament to the power of unity and the possibility of change. They had a long road ahead, but with each step, they would be guided by the collective strength of a community that refused to accept anything less than justice. 6 months had passed since Nathan Carter's wrongful arrest, and in that time, the city had changed in ways that few could have anticipated. What began as a single moment of injustice had sparked a movement, pushing both the police department and the community to confront difficult truths and work toward real reform. Now, as he stood before a group of newly sworn-in police officers, Nathan felt a sense of responsibility and hope that this was just the beginning of a larger transformation. The room was filled with fresh faces, young recruits who looked at Nathan with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Many had read about him or heard of the changes his case had inspired, but seeing him in person was different. He represented something profound, a bridge between law enforcement and the community they were sworn to serve. Nathan began his address with a simple statement. "I stand here today because of a painful experience, but that pain taught me something valuable about justice and about the power of accountability. Today, you have the power to ensure that justice isn't just an ideal, but a reality for every person you encounter. He paused, letting his words sink in, then continued. The badge you wear carries a tremendous responsibility. It's not just about enforcing the law. It's about upholding fairness, protecting the vulnerable, and being worthy of the public's trust. The people you serve look to you with hope, and it's up to you to be worthy of that trust. In the months following his release, Nathan had seen the city evolve. The community justice initiative he helped launch had become a fixture in the community, with officers and civilians working together to address systemic issues and prevent further injustices. The program's workshops on de-escalation techniques, cultural awareness, and community engagement had not only helped shift mindsets within the department but had also fostered empathy on both sides. This collaboration had led to a series of small but impactful victories, a testament to the power of persistence and partnership. In his speech, Nathan emphasized that the changes they'd fought for weren't just about avoiding another tragedy, but about building a culture of respect and mutual understanding. He shared stories of individuals who, through the program, had begun to view each other as allies rather than adversaries. Officers who had once approached their jobs with caution and suspicion now approached them with empathy, and residents who had once viewed the police with distrust now felt heard. These last few months, Nathan continued, have taught me that meaningful change is possible, but it requires honesty, openness, and a willingness to listen. There will be difficult days, but I believe in your ability to rise above them. By upholding your commitment to justice, you're not just serving the city, you're shaping its future. As he finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Nathan took a step back, watching the recruits and feeling a quiet sense of hope. They had the opportunity to create a new chapter, one where justice was truly for all. The impact of the reforms went beyond the police department, touching the lives of people throughout the city. Community leaders, teachers, parents, and even business owners noticed the changes, often commenting on the improved atmosphere. People who once feared encounters with law enforcement now felt more at ease, knowing they had advocates within the system who were committed to treating them fairly. In the months since his arrest, Nathan had seen attitudes shift, not just among officers but among citizens who realized they, too, had a role to play in shaping a just society. Through the community forums and public discussions, people began sharing their experiences and concerns, breaking down barriers that had once divided them. The movement that started with Nathan's release had grown into a citywide conversation about justice, fairness, and the need for accountability across all sectors of society. One of the most profound lessons of the past months was the realization that lasting change required patience and persistence. Nathan's case had illuminated the importance of addressing root causes, of acknowledging and correcting the mistakes of the past. But it had also shown that change was a shared responsibility, a collective journey that required empathy, dialogue, and understanding from everyone involved. The Community Justice Initiative had proven that collaboration could yield real results, but it had also underscored the complexity of reform. Some people remained skeptical, hesitant to believe that the changes would last. Yet for every doubter, there were others who had embraced the opportunity for a fresh start, determined to make the city a better place for future generations. As Nathan left the police academy that day, he took a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought him to this point. What had once been a painful, dehumanizing experience had become a catalyst for transformation. A reminder that, even in the darkest moments, there was potential for growth, for progress, and for healing. Walking through the city streets, Nathan sensed a new atmosphere. There was a lightness, a feeling of possibility, as if the city itself were breathing easier. People greeted him with smiles, and he could feel the warmth of a community that had come together, determined to build something meaningful out of the pain they'd endured. Nathan's experience served as a powerful reminder to everyone. True justice required courage, not just from those who enforced the law, but from those who held them accountable. Change was never easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but with persistence and unity, a community could transform its future, creating a system that reflected its highest ideals. In the end, Nathan had become more than just a symbol of reform. He had become a reminder of the potential for renewal, a beacon of hope that illuminated the path toward a fairer, more compassionate world. And as he looked out over the city, he knew that while the journey was far from over, they were well on their way to a brighter tomorrow.